At 2:47 in the morning, my father called me from a jail cell, his voice shaking so hard I almost couldn't understand him. Imani, baby, they're saying I put my hands on Bianca. I never touched that woman. Your brother watched the whole thing happen and didn't say one word. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if you've ever had to walk into a room and remind people exactly who they were dealing with, hit that like button right now. Because trust me, that is exactly what I did. My name is Imani Bellamy. I'm 31 years old, and I put white-collar criminals and dirty officials behind bars for a living. I'm an assistant district attorney assigned to the Public Corruption and Elder Fraud Unit in Harris County, Texas. I have sent bank executives to federal prison. I have taken down a city councilman who was skimming money from a senior housing fund. I know exactly what it looks like when powerful people build a lie brick by brick until it looks like the truth. And at 2:47 in the morning, standing in my kitchen in my pajamas, I realized my own family had just tried to build one of those lies around my father. My father, Reuben Bellamy, is 68 years old. He spent 31 years as a Houston firefighter, 17 of those years as a captain, and he pulled people out of burning buildings before I was even born. He is the kind of man who still gets up at dawn to walk the property line of the land his own grandfather bought with cash in 1952. Back when a black man buying land outright in this state was an act of quiet defiance. That land, 42 acres out past the 5th Ward, has been in our family for 4 generations. It is not just dirt to us. It is the only proof some counties kept no record of that we were here, that we built something, that nobody handed us anything. My father raised my brother Malik and me on that land every summer of our childhood. He taught us how to fix a fence line, how to read a property deed, how to never, ever sign something you haven't read 3 times. He is gentle. He has never raised a hand against another living soul in his entire life. Not even the drunk man who broke his nose during a bar fight he was trying to break up back in 1994. And now, according to a phone call from a booking officer at the 4th Ward precinct, he had allegedly assaulted his own daughter-in-law. The drive from my apartment to the precinct took 11 minutes. It felt like 11 years. My hands were shaking so badly on the steering wheel that I ran a yellow light I would normally never touch, because in my job, I have spent years watching the worst version of what happens when a black man's word goes up against a white woman's tears in front of a system that has already decided who to believe before either one of them opens their mouth. I have built entire prosecutions around exactly that imbalance. I never in my life thought I would be racing through downtown Houston at 3 in the morning to walk into the middle of it myself, with my own father's name on the paperwork. I want to back up for 1 second and tell you about Bianca, because you need to understand exactly what kind of storm my brother married into. Bianca Castellane is 29 years old. Her father, Desmond Castellane, is the majority owner of Castellane Energy Partners, a private oil and gas leasing firm that has spent the last 3 years quietly buying up mineral rights across the eastern edge of Harris County. Bianca grew up with a nanny, a driver, and a debit card with no limit that anyone ever bothered to explain to her. She married my brother 18 months ago in a wedding that cost more than my father made in 5 years as a firefighter. And from the very first dinner I sat through with her, I watched the way she looked at our family's land like she was already mentally subdividing it into parcels. I pushed through the glass doors of the precinct, and the first thing that hit me was the smell. Stale coffee and industrial disinfectant. And the second thing that hit me was the sight of my father sitting on a metal bench with his wrists cuffed behind his back and a split lip crusted with dried blood. Nobody was tending to him. No paramedic in sight. Across the room, Bianca sat wrapped in a police-issued blanket, sobbing into the shoulder of my brother Malik, while a young white officer crouched beside her offering her a bottled water like she was a survivor pulled from a car wreck. I did not scream. In my line of work, you learn very fast that raw emotion hands your power over to the other side of the table. Cold, documented, procedural precision is the only thing that actually moves a room. I walked straight toward my father, and Malik stepped directly into my path, his tailored blazer looking almost comical under the fluorescent lights of a police station at 3 a.m. "What are you doing here, Imani?" he said, and the condescension in his voice was the same condescension he has used on me since I was 12 years old and chose to spend my summers reading case law instead of following him around the country club his in-laws eventually bought their way into. "Go home. You're going to make this worse. Bianca's having a panic attack." "You let your wife put our father in handcuffs, Malik," I said, my voice level in a way that I knew unsettled him more than shouting ever could.
"And now you're standing here playing her bodyguard while Dad bleeds on a police station floor. Move!"
Hearing my voice, Bianca let out a theatrical wail.
"Keep her away from me!"
she cried, burying her face deeper into Malik's chest.
"He came at me. He didn't even recognize who I was. His mind is completely gone, Malik. You have to tell them."
It was a flawless performance. The kind of performance I have cross-examined 100 times on a witness stand. The classic weaponization of fragility, designed to paint a black man as dangerous and lock in her own position as the untouchable victim, before a single piece of evidence had even been reviewed. The officer stood, placing a protective hand near his belt as he moved toward me. "Ma'am, you need to step back. This is an active investigation." I did not look at Malik again. I turned my full attention to the officer. "My father has a laceration to his lip and possible bruised ribs," I said, loud enough for every desk in the bullpen to hear. "Why has he not received medical attention? And why is the alleged victim the only person in this room without a single visible injury?" "He assaulted this young woman," the officer said, his hand drifting toward his radio. "Her husband confirmed the older man's been struggling with dementia and had a violent episode tonight. We're processing the paperwork. You need to leave the premises or I will place you under arrest for interfering." He reached out to take my arm. That was his first mistake. I sidestepped his hand, unclasped my leather bag, and pulled out my credentials, holding them up directly in front of his face so he could read every single line. "I'm Imani Bellamy," I said. "I'm a licensed attorney in the state of Texas. I am an assistant district attorney with the Harris County Public Corruption and Elder Fraud Unit. And the man you're holding without medical care is my father. And as of this moment, my client. You are currently detaining a 68-year-old man with an active injury based solely on the unverified claim of a woman standing in front of me with no visible defensive wounds whatsoever." The color drained out of his face so fast, I actually felt a flicker of sympathy for him. And then I remembered my father's blood was still drying on his collar, and the sympathy evaporated. "Ma'am, I had no idea he was related to—" "That's exactly the problem," I said. "You didn't know who he was, so you assumed he was guilty. Get the cuffs off my father right now, or the next call I make is to your watch commander. And the one after that is to the reporter at Channel 11 who owes me a favor." I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. The direct line for the 4th Ward Watch Commander, a man I had worked 3 joint task force cases with over the years. It rang twice. "Commander Reyes," I said, never breaking eye contact with the officer in front of me. "I'm standing in your precinct right now. One of your officers has a bleeding 68-year-old man in cuffs on a bench while the woman who allegedly attacked him is drinking spring water on the county's dime. I need those cuffs off my father in the next 60 seconds, or my office is opening a civil rights inquiry into this precinct by sunrise. The shift in the room was instant. The desk sergeant, who had been ignoring the entire scene, suddenly grabbed his radio and called for a paramedic. The officer in front of me fumbled for his keys, nearly tripping over his own feet as he rushed to unlock my father's wrists. Bianca's crying stopped mid-breath, the theatrical sobs replaced by a flat, calculating stare as she watched her performance start to fall apart in real time. I knelt beside my father as the cuffs finally came off. I took his trembling hands in mine, my heart cracking at the sight of the raw skin around his wrists, but his eyes were sharp, clear, and completely lucid. "I'm okay, baby," he breathed, squeezing my fingers. "I'm not losing my mind. She came into my house tonight asking me to sign something. When I said no, she threw a lamp at me and started screaming that I attacked her before I even stood up out of my chair." Malik rushed over, his face flushed with a sudden desperate panic. "You're making this so much worse, Imani," he sputtered. "Dad doesn't know what he's saying half the time anymore. He's been slipping for months. Bianca was defending herself." I stood up, putting myself firmly between my bleeding father and my cowardly brother. "You watched your wife swing a lamp at our father, and you let a police officer cuff him instead of calling an ambulance for his lip. There is no version of tonight where you get to play the victim, Malik. Not with me." The paramedic arrived and began cleaning the cut above my father's mouth, and I watched Bianca's blue eyes track every single movement in the room with the cold precision of someone recalculating a strategy that had just collapsed. She was not a woman who had just survived a violent episode. She was a woman who had just lost round one. And I had spent enough years in courtrooms to know that people like her never, ever walk away after losing round one. They regroup. They come back sharper, and that thought, more than anything else that happened that night, was what kept me awake for the rest of it. They released my father with a warning that the investigation was still open, which is exactly the kind of bureaucratic nonsense that lets a false accusation sit on a man's record for months while nothing gets resolved. I drove him straight to Memorial Hermann to get his lip properly looked at and his ribs imaged, since he'd been favoring his left side the entire ride over and refusing to admit it hurt. The waiting room was nearly empty at 4 a.m, just the hum of vending machines and the distant beep of a monitor somewhere down the hall. I was on the phone with my paralegal, asking her to pull the incident report the second it hit the system, when the emergency room doors slammed open and my mother stormed in. Dorothy Bellamy was fully dressed in a cream pantsuit and her good pearls, her hair freshly set, despite it being 4 a.m. Malik and Bianca trailed in right behind her like she was leading a procession, which told me everything I needed to know about where they'd gone first after the precinct released them. Not to check on my father. To my mother's house. To get their story straight before I could tell mine. I stepped forward, genuinely expecting to see fear in my mother's eyes, expecting her to ask where her husband of 41 years was and how badly he was hurt. I opened my mouth to tell her he was fine, that he was just down the hall getting checked out. I never got the words out. My mother crossed the waiting room, raised her hand, and slapped me across the face so hard my ears rang. A nurse at the desk froze mid-sentence, but I held up a hand to signal I didn't need help, even though my cheek was burning and my eyes had gone hot with tears I refused to let fall. "Are you trying to tear this family apart, Imani?" my mother hissed, close enough that I could smell her mints. "You marched into that precinct and humiliated your brother in front of the entire department. You undermined him as a husband." I tasted copper where my teeth had caught the inside of my cheek. He let his wife hit our father with a lamp, Mom. Dad is 30 feet away from you right now getting his ribs checked, and you're worried about Malik being embarrassed. My mother didn't even glance toward the trauma bay doors. She turned instead and opened her arms toward Bianca, who stepped forward with a fresh, perfectly timed round of tears and a microscopic scratch on her forearm that she absolutely gave herself in the back of a squad car for effect. "Oh, you poor girl," my mother cooed, stroking Bianca's arm like it was a mortal wound. "I am so sorry for what you went through tonight. Please, you have to forgive Reuben. His mind just isn't what it used to be. And Imani has always been prone to these dramatic outbursts." I watched my own mother bow her head and apologize to the woman who had just tried to put my father in the hospital. And something in me went very, very cold. This was not new. This was decades in the making. My mother's lifelong hunger for proximity to money and status finally finding its perfect outlet in her son's marriage into the Castellane family. "You've lost your mind, Dorothy," I said, dropping the word mother entirely. "That woman assaulted your husband, and you're comforting her?" Bianca was defending herself, my mother snapped, her eyes flashing with a desperate, cornered anger. "You don't understand how the real world works, Imani. You never have. You sit in that little office fighting cases you can't even collect a real paycheck from while your brother is building something. Do you know who the Castellanes are? Desmond sits on 3 hospital boards. He could make or break Malik's entire future. And you're out here trying to ruin it over some old land nobody even uses anymore." The pieces clicked together with a clarity that turned my blood to ice. The speed of her defense. The total absence of surprise about my father's supposed decline. The pearls, put on at 4 a.m. specifically to perform composure in front of wealthy in-laws. She wasn't confused by Malik's story. She was a willing co-author of it. "You knew," I said slowly. "You knew Malik and Bianca were trying to get Dad declared incompetent. You knew this was about the land." Malik shifted behind Bianca, refusing to meet my eyes, but my mother didn't flinch. She lifted her chin with a chilling kind of righteousness. "Your father is a stubborn old fool holding on to some outdated piece of dirt, while a legitimate energy company is offering millions for the mineral rights underneath it. We scraped by for decades, Imani, while other people lived comfortably. That land could finally change something for this family, and he won't even discuss it." "So you helped them build a case to have him declared incompetent," I said, feeling sick. "You helped your son and his wife try to steal Dad's competency out from under him so you could cash a check." My mother stepped closer, and there was no mother left in her eyes at all, only a hollow, greedy shell of a woman who had traded her husband's dignity for a seat closer to money. "Your father has served his purpose, Imani," she said, voice dropping to something ugly and final. "Thanks to Malik, this family is finally about to be somebody. Do not get in the way of that." I didn't waste another breath on Dorothy. My grief evaporated, replaced by the same razor focus I bring to a courtroom, right as the trauma bay doors swung open and a tall physician in a pristine white coat walked out, his stride carrying the confidence of a man who never worked a public hospital's actual overnight shift by choice. His coat read, "Dr. Aldrich Feenan, Chief of Geriatric Behavioral Services." He walked straight past me toward Malik and Bianca. "Malik, Bianca," he said, voice dropping into something conspiratorial. I reviewed the chart and did a preliminary cognitive screening while they were finishing his stitches. Given the disorientation and the violent episode described in the intake notes, I'm prepared to file for an emergency competency evaluation. If it's approved, my facility can begin transport within 72 hours. My mother let out a sigh of relief and clutched her pearls. Finally, she murmured, some peace for this family. You will do absolutely nothing of the sort, I said, stepping directly into the center of their little circle. Dr. Feenan blinked at me like I was something unpleasant that had blown in off the street. Excuse me, this is a private medical conversation with the patient's family. I'm Imani Bellamy, I said. I'm the patient's daughter, and I happen to be a prosecutor who has spent 4 years specifically working elder financial exploitation cases. So before you file anything, I'd think very carefully about what you're about to put your name on. I pointed at the clipboard in his hands. You just told me you performed a preliminary cognitive screening on a patient who arrived with acute head trauma, active bleeding, and adrenaline levels that would make anyone temporarily disoriented. Under Texas law, an involuntary competency filing following physical trauma requires a full neurological workup to rule out the injury itself as the cause. Did you order one? Feenan's confident posture faltered. In my professional opinion, the patient is a danger to himself and his family. The paperwork is legitimate. Is it? I said, taking one more step so he had to look me directly in the eye. Because I pulled the timestamp metadata on the intake portal from my phone in the parking lot 20 minutes ago. Your clinic generated a preliminary competency evaluation form for Ruben Bellamy at 6:14 this evening. That's nearly 9 hours before this alleged violent episode ever happened. The blood drained out of Feenan's face so fast it left him a sickly gray. He looked over at Malik, exposing the entire conspiracy without saying another word. That's a serious accusation, Feenan stammered. It's a documented fact, I said, holding up my phone. And it gets worse. I ran your clinic's public filings on the drive over. Sunrise Cognitive Partners received a $200,000 community wellness donation last quarter from a private foundation controlled by Castellane Energy Partners. That's the exact same family your patient's daughter-in-law belongs to. So let's review the facts on the table. You accepted money from this woman's family, then pre-generated a fraudulent competency filing on her father-in-law before the alleged incident that supposedly justified it even occurred. That's not medical malpractice, doctor. That's wire fraud and elder abuse conspiracy, and I promise you, my office prosecutes both. Bianca stepped forward, her fragile victim act evaporating in an instant. Doctor, she snapped, my father funds half your foundation's annual budget. You are going to sign that transfer order right now, or I will personally make sure your clinic loses every dollar of it by Monday. It was the single most useful mistake she could have possibly made. She had just confirmed the entire financial conspiracy out loud in a crowded emergency room in front of a witness with a law degree and a recorder running. Thank you, Bianca, I said, tapping the screen of my phone. I got that. Now, Dr. Feenan, you have 10 seconds. Either you proceed with a fraudulent filing and I hand this recording and the timestamp to the Texas Medical Board and the FBI tomorrow morning, or you do your actual job. The silence stretched painfully long. Feenan looked at Bianca's fuming, entitled glare, then back at me, and some instinct for self-preservation finally overrode his greed. His hand shook as he pulled a pen from his coat pocket, flipped the clipboard over, and drew a hard line through the filing. Upon secondary review of the patient's acute trauma, he announced, voice unsteady, I find no evidence of chronic cognitive decline. The disorientation is consistent with the head injury alone. The patient is fully competent. The evaluation is void. No, Malik said, lunging forward and grabbing the doctor's sleeve. You can't do this. We had an arrangement. Feenan yanked his arm away, panic written across his face. Don't ever contact me again, he snapped, before turning and nearly sprinting down the corridor. Malik stood frozen in the middle of the hallway, watching the entire architecture of his plan collapse in under 5 minutes. Because with the evaluation voided, the medical power of attorney he'd been quietly having drafted for weeks was suddenly worthless. It only activates when a patient is declared incapacitated. My father was awake, coherent, and fully in control of his own life, and there was nothing Malik or Bianca could do about it. Not tonight, anyway. Bianca turned to me, and the trembling hands and glassy eyes were gone completely. In their place was a rigid posture, and a stare so cold and pure it was almost impressive. She had lost the police station. She had just lost the hospital. But Bianca Castellan had been raised believing the world belonged to her by default, and she was not about to walk away with nothing. She took a slow step toward me, a nasty little smile spreading across her lips. You really think you won tonight, Imani? You're out of moves, I said, holding my ground. It's over. She laughed, short and sharp. Oh, honey, you're so busy playing the hero you forgot to check the county clerk's website. It doesn't matter that you kept that old man out of a facility. It doesn't matter if he's competent, because the Auburn Bend land isn't fully yours to protect anymore. My heart skipped an erratic beat. What are you talking about? She tilted her head, her smile widening into something genuinely cruel. Why do you think we needed the medical filing in such a hurry, Imani? Not to sell the land, to clean up a signature that's already sitting in a filing cabinet at the county recorder's office. Malik has power of attorney on a mineral lease your father signed 8 months ago. 60-year term, full drilling and extraction rights to Castellane Energy. All we needed was a competency ruling to make sure nobody could challenge it before the deal finalizes next month. I stared at her, feeling the floor shift under my feet. My father would never in 100 years sign away 60 years of mineral rights on land his grandfather bled to buy, which meant one of two things. Either that signature was forged, or my father had been tricked into signing something he didn't fully understand. Both were federal crimes. Both were about to become the entire focus of my life for the next several weeks. You're bluffing, I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I could hear how thin they sounded. Pull the filing yourself, Bianca said, already turning to walk away, victory settling back into her shoulders. Recorder's office opens at 8. Enjoy your morning, counselor. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my father's kitchen at 6 a.m. with a cup of coffee going cold in front of me, watching him wince every time he shifted in his chair. And I made a decision that would define the next 6 weeks of my life. I was done reacting to whatever Malik and Bianca threw at us, one crisis at a time. I was going to build a case, the same way I built every case that had ever put a criminal behind bars, methodically, with documentation, with subpoenas, with witnesses who didn't even know yet that they were witnesses. The recorder's office confirmed it that morning. There it was, filed 8 months earlier. A 60-year mineral extraction lease on all 42 acres of the Auburn Bend property. My father's signature at the bottom, notarized by a name I didn't recognize. A notary whose commission, I would later discover, had actually expired 4 months before the date on the document. My father looked at the printout in my hands and went completely still. I never signed that, he said quietly. I've never even met whoever this Aldrich Feenan is outside of tonight. And I sure as hell never signed my name next to a stranger's notary stamp. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a rage so old and so deep it had nowhere left to go. 42 years I paid the taxes on that land myself, Imani. Every single year. Nobody touches it without my say-so. I believed him instantly and completely. Not because he was my father, but because I had cross-examined enough forged documents in my career to know exactly what one looks like under a magnifying glass. And this one had all the telltale seams. The signature pressure was uniform in a way real signatures never are. The notary's expired commission was the kind of detail a careless forger misses because they're moving fast and counting on nobody checking. Somebody had built this entire scheme in the dark, betting that my father would either never notice or never live long enough to fight it. That was the moment I stopped thinking of this as a family dispute and started building it like a federal case. I called Denise Okafor first thing that morning, a private investigator I had used on 3 previous prosecutions, a former forensic document examiner who left the crime lab because she got tired of watching cases get buried by budget cuts. I sent her the lease, the notary stamp, and everything else I had, and by that evening she called me back with a voice that told me this was worse than one forged signature. "Imani," she said, "I ran the notary's commission number through the Secretary of State database. It expired in March. But that's not the part you need to sit down for. I cross-referenced the notary's name against every real estate filing in Harris County over the last 2 years. This same expired commission has stamped 11 other property transfers, all in the 5th Ward and Independence Heights, all involving Black landowners over the age of 60, all involving mineral or drilling leases, and every single one of them routes back to the same shell company registered to a Castellane Energy Partners subsidiary called Blue Bonnet Land Holdings." I sat down hard on my kitchen stool. My father's land wasn't a one-off grudge. It was a pattern. Bianca's family had built a quiet, systematic pipeline for stripping mineral rights out from under elderly Black homeowners across some of the oldest, historically Black neighborhoods in the city, using forged notarizations, staged competency evaluations, and family members who were either complicit or coerced into signing off. Malik wasn't just betraying our father for a bigger house. He had become one small gear in a machine that had already done this to at least 11 other families who had no idea their land was even at risk yet. That changed everything. This was no longer just about protecting my father's 42 acres. This was a public corruption case, with my own last name sitting right in the middle of it. And I had exactly the training, the office, and the subpoena power to actually take it apart. I confronted Malik 3 days later, alone, at a diner off Almeda Road where I knew Bianca would never set foot. He looked exhausted in a way I hadn't expected. The arrogance from the police station replaced by something closer to fear. "I need you to tell me the truth," I said, sliding a folder across the table with the 11 other filings inside it. "Not for Dad, for yourself. Because right now, you are one signature away from a federal fraud conspiracy charge, and I promise you, Bianca's father will let you take every ounce of that fall alone if it protects his company." Malik stared at the folder for a long time before he finally spoke. And what came out of him wasn't the smug golden child I'd grown up resenting. It was something smaller and more desperate. "You don't understand what it's like being married into that family, Imani. Desmond found out about a gambling debt I had 2 years ago, before Bianca and I even got engaged. $90,000 to people you do not want finding your address. He paid it off in one phone call like it was nothing. And then he made sure I understood exactly what that phone call cost me. Every year since, there's been something. Co-sign this, notarize that. Get your father to sign here. I told myself it was just paperwork. I told myself Dad would never actually lose the land, that it was just some kind of formality for tax purposes. I didn't know about the other 11 families until you just showed me. I swear to you, I didn't know. I wanted to hate him completely in that moment, and part of me still did. But I had also spent enough years prosecuting exploitation to recognize the shape of a man who had been slowly strangled into complicity by someone smarter and colder than he was. That didn't make him innocent. It made him useful. "You're going to help me," I said. "Not because I forgive you. Because it's the only way you walk out of this with anything left of your life." Malik didn't say yes right away, but he didn't say no either. And 3 days after that, he handed me something that changed the entire trajectory of the case. A recorded phone call from Desmond Castellan himself, casually instructing him to have our father declared incompetent before the end of the fiscal quarter, so the mineral lease could close without any legal challenge. I listened to that recording 4 times before I finally called my supervisor, District Attorney Priscilla Van, at 11 o'clock at night, because I needed her to hear Desmond Castellan's voice with her own ears before I said another word about strategy. She listened in silence, and when it finished, she said one sentence that told me everything about how seriously my office was about to take this. "Get me a wire on your brother, Imani, and get me the other 11 victims. We are not touching this until we can take down the entire operation at once, not just your father's piece of it." That was the beginning of 6 of the longest weeks of my life. Denise and I spent them building the case with the same patience I use on every white-collar prosecution. One document at a time, one witness at a time, refusing to let emotion rush a single step. We tracked down 4 of the 11 other families whose land had been touched by the same forged notary stamp. 2 of them had already lost their property outright, their homes sold out from under them by relatives who had been quietly financially entangled with the Castellan family for years. One family, the Odells, 2 blocks over from my father's land, agreed to meet with me in their living room, and their 81-year-old matriarch, Miss Ruth Ann Odell, held my hand across her kitchen table and told me she had signed papers she never fully understood because her own grandson brought a notary to her hospital bedside 3 days after her hip surgery while she was still on pain medication and told her it was just insurance paperwork. "I didn't want to believe my own blood would do that to me," Miss Ruth Ann said, her voice barely above a whisper. But I knew something was wrong when the mineral checks started arriving addressed to a company I never heard of, made out for pennies on what that land was worth. Every conversation like that hardened my resolve. This wasn't a family squabble over an inheritance anymore. This was a documented, years-long pattern of elder financial exploitation targeting Black landowners in some of the oldest, historically Black neighborhoods in Houston, dressed up as respectable business by a company with a glass office tower downtown and a foundation named after Desmond Castellan's late mother. My father agreed to something I never would have asked of him if he hadn't offered it himself. Over dinner one night, 2 weeks into the investigation, he set down his fork and looked at me with the same steady calm he'd had his entire life, the calm that used to walk him into burning buildings. "I want to be bait," he said. "If Malik and Bianca think I'm still slipping, if they think their plan is still alive, they'll keep talking. They'll keep making mistakes in front of people who are close enough to record them. Let me play the part, Imani. I raised you to fight fire with strategy, not just anger. Let me help you fight this one the same way." I hated the idea for exactly 4 seconds before I understood he was right. So we built it together. My father would let word quietly reach Malik, through our mother, that he'd had a small dizzy spell, that he was starting to seem forgetful, that maybe, just maybe, the family should revisit the conversation about the land after all. It was a gamble, feeding a lie to people who had already tried to weaponize one against him, but it was a controlled gamble, one built on documentation and federal oversight instead of a lamp swung in a dark living room. It took less than 9 days for Malik to call him. The wire Denise fitted my father with picked up every word of that conversation. Malik gently, almost lovingly, encouraging our father to consider signing over full power of attorney just to make things easier on everyone, while Bianca sat in the background of the call, coaching him through a speakerphone on exactly which reassuring phrases would land best. It was one of the most stomach-turning pieces of audio I had ever listened to in my career, precisely because of how tender it sounded, how much it sounded like love, when it was actually a script written to steal a man's legal identity out from under him. And then, 3 weeks into the investigation, Desmond Castelaine announced the event that would become the final act of this entire story. A black tie gala at the Hyatt Regency downtown, celebrating what his invitation called a generational partnership between the Castelaine and Bellamy families, honoring community, legacy, and the future of sustainable energy in Houston's historic neighborhoods. The gala would formally unveil the Auburn Bend Mineral Development Project to the public, with Malik and Bianca as the guests of honor, and my father, according to the program that had already gone to print, scheduled to give a short speech on behalf of the Bellamy family legacy. A speech Malik had already drafted for him, full of gratitude for the Castelaine family's generosity. They were going to parade my father on stage like a trophy. A smiling, cooperative old man handing his own history over to the people who had spent months trying to steal it. And they were going to do it in front of 300 of the wealthiest, most influential people in Houston. I looked at that invitation and I felt something settle into place inside me, cold and certain. If they wanted a stage, I was going to give them the biggest one they had ever stood on. And I was going to make sure federal agents were standing in the wings when the curtain came up. Before you tell you about the night of the gala, I need to tell you about the twist that changed how I understood every single thing that had happened up to that point. Because it didn't come from a courtroom or an evidence file. It came from Malik, on a Tuesday night, sitting in my car outside his own house because he was too afraid to say it inside walls Bianca might have bugged. "There's something you need to know before this goes any further," he said, staring straight ahead through the windshield instead of at me. "I didn't meet Bianca at a charity gala like I told everyone. Desmond's company had already identified Dad's land 2 years before Bianca and I ever spoke. They ran title searches on every parcel along the Eastern Mineral Corridor, cross-referenced them against the families who owned them, and built profiles on the adult children. I was 28, single, working a mid-level job at a firm that did occasional contract work for Castelaine Energy. Bianca was introduced to me at a company event that Desmond arranged personally. I found out about a year into the marriage that he'd told her, before we ever met, that marrying into the Bellamy family could make the Auburn Bend acquisition, in his words, clean and painless instead of expensive and litigated. I sat there in stunned silence for a long moment, feeling something shift and resettle in my understanding of the entire year. Bianca hadn't fallen in love and then discovered an opportunity. The opportunity had come first, and Malik, and by extension our entire family, had been the target of a calculated, Years-long acquisition strategy dressed up as a wedding. It was the kind of cold, clinical cruelty I had genuinely never encountered outside of the most calculated fraud cases I'd prosecuted, and it had been sitting at our family's Thanksgiving table for 18 months. "Does she know that you know?" I asked. "No," Malik said. "And I need you to understand something else, Imani. I'm not telling you this to make what I did to Dad okay. Nothing makes that okay. I'm telling you because I think some part of her has known this whole time that she was raised to be a tool for her father's business, the same way I let myself be turned into one. And I think that's the only thing that might actually crack her open in front of a room full of people who worship her family name. If you're going to do this at the gala, that's the wound to press." I didn't fully trust Malik yet, not after everything. But I filed that piece of information away with the same care I file every piece of evidence. Because in my experience, the most devastating confrontations are never built on anger. They're built on the one true thing the other person has spent their entire life trying not to look at directly. The FBI's Public Corruption Division formally opened a parallel federal investigation 11 days before the gala. Once Denise's pattern evidence on the 11 forged filings crossed the threshold from a county fraud case into wire fraud and interstate financial conspiracy, given that 2 of Castellane Energy's shell entities were registered in Delaware and Oklahoma. Special Agent Renata Cho became my primary point of contact, a sharp, unflappable woman who had spent 6 years working elder exploitation task forces across the Gulf Coast, and who told me on our first call that this was, without exaggeration, one of the largest documented patterns of racially targeted elder land fraud her division had seen in a decade. "We want the gala," Agent Cho told me during our final planning call, 48 hours before the event. "Public event, recorded speeches, a room full of witnesses who can't later claim they didn't hear what they heard. If Desmond Castellane is arrogant enough to announce this deal in front of 300 people, we're arrogant enough to arrest him in front of 300 people too." My father listened to the entire plan sitting at his kitchen table, hands folded, the same composed stillness he used to carry into every fire scene of his career. When Agent Cho finished laying it out, he asked only one question. "Do I still get to give my speech?" Agent Cho glanced at me, unsure how to answer, but I already knew exactly what my father meant. Because I had grown up watching this man walk toward danger with his shoulders squared and his voice steady, and I knew he wasn't asking permission. He was telling us he intended to be standing on his own 2 feet, in full command of every word out of his mouth, at the exact moment the room found out the truth. He had let them cuff him, drug the narrative about his mind, and parade him around as a declining old man for 6 weeks. He had earned the right to stand back up. "Yes, Dad," I said. "You get to give your speech. You just might not be reading the one Malik wrote for you." He smiled for the first time in weeks, small and tired but completely real. "Good," he said. "I already threw that one away." The ballroom at the Hyatt Regency was lit gold that night, chandeliers throwing soft light over round tables dressed in ivory linen, each centerpiece a small bronze oil derrick wrapped in magnolia blossoms, which struck me as the single most tone-deaf piece of event design I had ever seen in my life. A literal drilling rig decorating the tables at a party built on the theft of black land. 300 guests filled the room, oil executives in tuxedos, city council members who owed their campaigns to Castellani donations, socialites who had never once set foot in the Fifth Ward but had strong opinions about its revitalization. A jazz quartet played somewhere near the bar, and waiters circulated with trays of champagne that cost more per glass than some of the victims in this case received in an entire year from the leases stolen out from under them. I wore a plain black dress, no jewelry, flat shoes I could move quickly in if I needed to, and I carried a small clutch that held, among other things, a burner phone with a single contact saved under the name Renata's Catering, which was Agent Cho's team stationed in a service corridor 2 doors down from the main ballroom, along with 4 additional agents seated at tables scattered through the crowd, dressed as guests, sipping water instead of champagne, waiting for my signal. My father arrived exactly on schedule, wheeled in by a private nurse Malik and Bianca had hired for the evening. A soft gray blanket draped over his lap, his tuxedo jacket buttoned neatly despite the wheelchair, playing the role of a gently declining patriarch with a performance so convincing it actually made my chest ache to watch, even knowing it was a performance. Bianca had insisted on the wheelchair for what she called optics, and my father had agreed instantly, because he understood better than any of us that letting them believe they had already won was the entire architecture of the trap. Desmond Castellane took the small stage first, tall, silver-haired, radiating the specific brand of unbothered confidence that comes from never once in his life being told no by anyone who mattered. "Tonight," he announced into the microphone, his voice warm and practiced, "we celebrate something rare in this city. A true partnership between families, between generations, between a legacy of community and a legacy of industry. The Bellamy family has entrusted us with something precious, and Castellane Energy intends to honor that trust for the next 60 years and beyond." The room applauded politely. I watched my mother, seated at the head table beside Bianca in a deep emerald gown, dab at her eyes with a napkin, genuinely moved by a speech built entirely on a forged signature. Malik spoke next, and to his credit, his voice shook slightly on certain lines, small cracks in a performance he no longer fully believed in, though nobody in that room besides me and, I suspected, Bianca herself could have picked up on it. He talked about honoring his father's legacy. He talked about building a bridge between old Houston and new Houston. He never once looked directly at our father while he spoke, and I understood exactly why. Some part of him already knew what was coming. Then Bianca stood, radiant in a silver dress that caught the chandelier light like water, and thanked the crowd for supporting what she called a new chapter for a family I have come to love as my own. She reached down and squeezed my father's shoulder as she said it, and I watched him hold perfectly still under her hand, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed somewhere past the crowd, and I understood in that moment exactly how much this entire evening was costing him to endure. Finally, Desmond returned to the microphone and gestured toward my father's wheelchair. "And now, a few words from the man who started it all, Mr. Reuben Bellamy." The nurse began to wheel him toward the small ramp beside the stage, and this was the moment, the exact second Agent Cho and I had planned down to the breath, the moment before the microphone reached my father's hand, when everything in that gilded room was still under Desmond Castellane's illusion of control. I stood up from my table. Every head in the ballroom turned. I walked toward the small stage with the same measured, unhurried stride I use walking toward a jury box, because I needed this room to see composure, not chaos. Needed them to understand from the very first second that what was about to happen was not a family outburst, but a reckoning that had been built brick by brick with evidence. "Before my father speaks," I said, taking the second microphone from its stand near the edge of the stage, "I think this room deserves to actually understand what's being celebrated here tonight." My voice carried clean and steady across the silent ballroom. "Because this is not a partnership. This is the 11th documented case of a scheme that Castellane Energy Partners has run against elderly Black landowners across the Fifth Ward and Independence Heights for the last 3 years. Desmond's polished smile didn't fully crack yet, but it thinned. "I think my daughter's sister-in-law has had a bit too much champagne," he said smoothly into his own microphone, drawing a nervous ripple of laughter from a few tables. "Security, perhaps escort—" "I haven't had a drop," I said. "I'm Imani Bellamy, Assistant District Attorney, Harris County Public Corruption and Elder Fraud Unit, and I would strongly advise your security not to touch me, because there are 4 federal agents currently seated in this room, and at least one of them is recording everything you say right now." The nervous laughter died instantly. I watched color drain from several faces at the tables closest to the stage. The same physical reaction I have watched 1,000 times in a courtroom the exact second a defendant realizes the walls have already closed around them, and they simply haven't noticed yet. "The mineral lease your foundation is celebrating tonight," I continued, "was secured through a forged notarization, filed under an expired commission belonging to a notary who has now stamped 11 separate fraudulent property transfers across 2 historically Black Houston neighborhoods. Every single one of them tracing back to a Castellane subsidiary called Blue Bonnet Land Holdings. My own father never signed this lease. His signature was forged onto it while your daughter and my brother staged an elaborate and ultimately fraudulent competency filing designed to make sure nobody could challenge that forgery in court before the deal closed." "This is slander," Desmond said, his voice sharpening now, the practiced warmth gone entirely. "Baseless, defamatory slander. And I promise you, young lady, my lawyers will—" "Your lawyers," I said, "are welcome to review the 11 forged filings, the recorded phone call in which you personally instructed your son-in-law to secure a fraudulent competency ruling before the end of the fiscal quarter, and the $200,000 donation your foundation made to the exact clinic that filed a predated evaluation form on my father 9 hours before an incident it was supposedly evaluating." A collective gasp moved through the room like wind through wheat. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. Bianca's face had gone completely white, her champagne glass frozen halfway to her lips. "Bianca," I said, turning to face her directly, "you told me at the hospital that this was already finished, that the deal was already sitting in a filing cabinet. What you didn't tell me is that your marriage to my brother wasn't a love story. It was a title search." The room's murmur turned into something sharper, more scandalized, and I watched something in Bianca's carefully composed face genuinely fracture for the first time all night. Not performed distress, real distress. The specific look of a person hearing the true shape of their own life spoken aloud in front of everyone whose opinion they had spent their entire existence curating. "That's not," she started, her voice cracking. "That's not how it—" "Your father identified my father's land 2 years before you ever met Malik," I said, quieter now, no longer performing for the room, speaking almost directly to her. "He built a profile on our family. He arranged the introduction. You were the plan, Bianca, the same way Malik became the plan once he married in. I don't know if you knew that from the beginning or found out somewhere along the way, but I think some part of you has always known. And I think that's exactly why you've spent 18 months trying so hard to convince everyone, maybe even yourself, that this was real." For one long, suspended second, the entire glittering room went absolutely silent, waiting to see which version of Bianca Castellane was going to answer that. Bianca set her champagne glass down on the nearest table so hard the stem cracked. "You have no idea what it's like," she said, her voice rising, all polish gone now, replaced by something raw and furious. To grow up knowing you're an asset before you're a daughter. To know every friendship, every relationship, every marriage your father ever approved of came with a spreadsheet attached to it. You want to stand there and act like I'm some kind of monster, Imani? I didn't build this system. I inherited it. I have been trained since I was 7 years old to smile at exactly the right moment and cry at exactly the right moment. And I got so good at it that I forgot how to tell the difference between performing love and feeling it. So yes, fine. Maybe I did know, somewhere underneath everything, that Malik was a transaction before he was a husband. That doesn't make what your father is accusing my family of untrue, but it doesn't make it a lie either. And I am so tired. I am so unbelievably tired of being the only Castellane in this room anyone is looking at right now. She turned, sharp and sudden, toward her father. Tell them, Daddy. Tell them you didn't build this whole thing on my back. Desmond Castellane did not move to comfort his daughter. He did not step toward her. He adjusted his cufflink, glanced briefly at the 4 men in dark suits who had just begun moving quietly through the crowd toward the stage, and in that single, unhurried gesture, I watched him make the exact same calculation my own mother had made in a hospital waiting room weeks earlier. A cold, instant triage of which relationship was worth protecting and which one had just become a liability. I built a company, Desmond said flatly, not even bothering to raise his voice. And I am not going to let unverified accusations at a party unravel decades of legitimate business because my daughter can't manage her own marriage. The words landed on Bianca like a physical blow. I watched 30 years of a father's conditional love collapse into that one sentence. And for the briefest instant, before her face hardened back into something cold and defensive, I actually felt something close to pity for her. The specific, complicated pity you feel for someone who was never given the tools to be anything other than exactly what they became. That was when Agent Cho stepped forward, badge already raised, 3 agents fanning out behind her. Desmond Castellane, she said, her voice cutting cleanly through the stunned silence of the ballroom. You're under arrest for wire fraud, conspiracy to commit elder financial exploitation, and violations of federal notary and title fraud statutes. She began reading him his rights, while a second agent moved toward Bianca, who had gone rigid, her manicured hands curling into fists at her sides. Malik stood frozen near the edge of the stage, watching his wife's family crumble in real time. And then he did something I genuinely did not expect, even after everything he had already given me. He stepped forward, in front of the entire room, and spoke into the abandoned microphone. I need to say something, he said, his voice shaking but audible. Everything my sister just told you is true, and there's more. I let it happen. I let my father-in-law manipulate me because I was drowning in debt and too proud to admit it. And I let my own father get handcuffed in a police station because I was afraid of losing a life I hadn't even earned. I've been cooperating with the district attorney's office for 3 weeks. I wore a wire on my own father-in-law. I am not asking anyone in this room to forgive me. I'm asking my father, too. The room, which had already absorbed more shock than most crowds absorb in a decade, seemed to hold its breath as every eye turned toward the wheelchair at the edge of the stage, waiting to see how a man who had been handcuffed, drugged with a bad diagnosis, and paraded through his own community's betrayal was going to respond to his son's public confession. That was when my father reached down, unbuckled the blanket from around his lap, and stood up. He did not wobble. He did not slump. My father rose to his full 6 feet, adjusted the lapels of his tuxedo with the same unhurried dignity he used to carry into a burning building, and looked out over a ballroom that had gone completely, utterly silent. "I was never losing my mind," he said, his voice carrying without needing the microphone, deep and steady and clear enough to reach every table in that room. "I let them believe I was. I let my own family believe I was slipping, because my daughter told me if I played my part long enough, greed would do the rest of the work for us. And it did." He looked at Malik, and there was something complicated in his eyes, grief and anger and, underneath all of it, the smallest thread of something that might one day, given enough years, become forgiveness. "You broke my heart, son. I want you to sit with that for the rest of your life. But you did not break this family's legacy. You almost let someone else do it for you. But you didn't finish the job. And tonight you finally did something that mattered. That's not nothing. That's not everything either. But it's not nothing." He turned his gaze toward Bianca, whose wrists were already being secured behind her back by the second agent, her carefully constructed composure gone completely, replaced by something almost childlike in its devastation. "I don't know what it cost you to grow up the way you did," my father said to her, and his voice held no cruelty in it at all, only a tired, weary clarity. "I genuinely don't. But my grandfather bought that land with cash money in 1952 because there was a time in this country when a black man's word on a piece of paper wasn't worth the paper it was printed on, unless he could produce hard currency to back it up. He built something out of nothing, so his children and his children's children would never have to ask anyone's permission to exist on their own ground. You tried to take that away with a forged signature and a rigged doctor's appointment. And I want you to understand, before they take you out of this room, that it was never yours to take." Bianca didn't answer him. She had nothing left to perform with, no tears left that would land the way they used to, no father standing behind her to catch the fall. The agents led her toward the side exit, her silver dress catching the light one last time, and she didn't look back at the room she had spent her entire adult life trying to belong to. My mother had not moved from her seat at the head table this entire time, her hand still pressed over her mouth, her carefully set hair beginning to come loose from its pins. When my father's eyes finally found hers across the ballroom, I watched 41 years of marriage compress into a single, unbearable look. "Reuben," she started, her voice small in a way I had genuinely never heard from her before. "I didn't know it would go this far. I swear to you, You knew enough, Dorothy," my father said quietly, and there was no theater left in his voice at all, just plain, exhausted honesty. "You knew enough to slap our daughter in a hospital hallway for trying to protect me. You knew enough to apologize to the woman who put her hands on your husband. I don't need you to explain yourself to this whole room. I just need you to know that I heard every single word you said that night. And I am not going home with you tonight, or maybe any night after this one." The ballroom, 300 of Houston's wealthiest and most connected people, watched a marriage quietly end in real time, somewhere underneath the much louder collapse of a multi-million-dollar fraud conspiracy. And somehow, that smaller heartbreak was the part of the evening that stayed with me the longest. The rest of that night dissolved into the kind of controlled chaos I had only ever seen from the outside in courtroom testimony, never lived through myself. Agents moved Desmond and Bianca out through a service corridor to avoid the cameras that had already started gathering outside once someone's phone video of the confrontation hit social media, before dessert was even served. Guests scattered in clusters, whispering, some pulling out phones to call their own lawyers, wondering how many of their own family trusts had ever brushed against a Castellan subsidiary. The jazz quartet, to their credit, kept playing softly through the entire thing because nobody had told them to stop. And there was something almost absurd and almost beautiful about hearing a slow, mournful saxophone line drifting over a room being dismantled by federal agents. I found my father sitting quietly at an empty table near the stage, his tuxedo jacket back on properly now, a glass of water in front of him that he hadn't touched. Malik sat 2 seats down, his head in his hands, an agent standing nearby, not yet placing him in cuffs, waiting for instructions from Agent Cho on how his cooperation agreement would be processed. "You did good tonight," I told my father, sitting down beside him, my legs finally giving out from the adrenaline that had been carrying me since I first stood up from my table. "I didn't do anything," he said. "I stood up out of a wheelchair. You did all the work, baby. You've been doing the work since you were 3 in the morning in a police station, listening to a boy officer decide he could put his hands on you." He reached over and took my hand, his grip still steady despite everything. "Your grandfather used to tell me that the land would outlive every lie anybody ever told about it, as long as somebody in the family was stubborn enough to keep fighting for it. I always thought that somebody would be me. Turns out it was you." I did not cry in that ballroom. Not with agents still working and reporters gathering outside, and my mother sitting frozen at the head table with her marriage in ruins around her. But I let myself feel the full weight of it for exactly 1 breath. My father's hand in mine, the saxophone still playing somewhere behind us. Before I stood back up and went to find Agent Cho to finish the paperwork that would keep this case airtight for the next 18 months of prosecution ahead of us. The weeks that followed were not glamorous. Federal indictments rarely are, no matter how dramatic their opening act. Desmond Castellane was charged with wire fraud, conspiracy to commit mail and wire fraud, and 11 separate counts of financial exploitation of the elderly, one for every family whose land had been touched by Bluebonnet land holdings. His attorneys, 3 different firms working in coordinated shifts, tried everything imaginable to slow the case down. They filed motions to suppress the wire recording, arguing entrapment, which failed the moment Agent Cho's team demonstrated that Malik had voluntarily approached the FBI weeks before any recording device was ever placed on him. They tried to argue the notary fraud predated Desmond's direct involvement and belonged entirely to a mid-level real estate manager who had since fled the country, until Denise Okafor produced 6 years of internal emails showing Desmond personally approving quarterly acquisition targets for the Mineral Corridor program. Each target a specific elderly homeowner's name and parcel number. 2 months into the prosecution, someone tried a different approach entirely. I came into my office on a Tuesday morning to find an anonymous letter waiting on my desk, no return address, containing photographs of me at a restaurant 2 nights earlier, having dinner with a colleague, alongside a printed note that read simply, "Careful who you're seen with, counselor. People remember favors." I photographed the letter, logged it into evidence, and reported it to Agent Cho within the hour. It was traced, eventually, to a private security contractor with a standing retainer from one of Desmond's outside law firms, and it became one more count added to the growing pile of obstruction charges his legal team would eventually have to answer for. If anything, it only strengthened the case. Nothing convinces a jury faster of guilt than watching the defense try to intimidate the prosecutor instead of simply trusting the facts. I went back to see Miss Ruth Ann Odell 3 weeks after the gala. Not as a prosecutor this time, just as myself, carrying a bag of peaches from the farmer's market near her house because my father always told me you don't walk into an elder's home empty-handed. She met me at her front door in a housecoat, her silver hair wrapped neatly, and she held both my hands in hers before I even got through the doorway. "I saw the news," she said. "My grandson called me crying, said he didn't know the whole extent of what he'd gotten pulled into, said Desmond's people threatened to expose some old debt of his if he didn't keep bringing me papers to sign. I don't know if I believe him yet. I don't know if I ever fully will. But I know you're the reason the mineral company is being forced to void every single lease and pay full restitution on the land value they were sitting on, back paid with interest. And I know you're the reason I get to die on my own dirt, instead of some assisted living facility my grandson was already touring behind my back." She squeezed my hands hard enough that I felt it in my knuckles. "You tell your daddy that this whole neighborhood is praying for that man. What he went through, being handcuffed on his own land's account. That's the oldest story there is around here, and it's about time somebody made it end different." I carried that conversation with me through every deposition, every discovery motion, every long night reviewing financial records that followed. 7 of the 11 families eventually joined a coordinated civil restitution claim my office helped structure alongside the criminal prosecution. And by the time the federal case against Desmond Castelain finally reached a plea agreement, 11 months later, avoiding a trial that would have dragged on for years and given his attorneys endless opportunities to exhaust the victim's resolve, the settlement included full restitution of stolen mineral rights, a public admission of the pattern of racially targeted exploitation, and a mandatory 5-year federal prison sentence with no possibility of the kind of quiet, comfortable minimum security arrangement his lawyers had clearly been angling for from the very beginning. Bianca's case resolved differently and more quietly than I expected. She pled guilty to reduced charges, perjury, and filing a false police report stemming from the original incident with my father, in exchange for cooperating fully against her own father's broader operation. Testimony that ultimately became some of the most damning material in the entire federal case, because unlike Malik's secondhand knowledge, Bianca had grown up inside the machine and knew exactly how every gear of it turned. She received 18 months, most of it eventually served in a minimum security facility, and when I saw her one final time at a pretrial hearing, thinner, stripped of the diamonds and the practiced softness, she caught my eye across the courtroom for just a moment. "I hope you understand," she said quietly, before her attorney pulled her toward the exit, "that some of it was real. Not the deal, not the plan, but some of it, Amani, was real." I didn't answer her. I still don't fully know what I believe about that, and some part of me has made peace with never knowing for certain, because the truth is, it doesn't actually change anything about what happened to my father, or to Miss Ruth Ann, or to the other 9 families whose names filled a federal indictment that will exist in the public record long after every person in that ballroom has been forgotten. Malik's cooperation agreement kept him out of federal prison, though it didn't keep him out of consequences. He pled guilty to a single count of conspiracy to commit fraud, received 5 years of probation, a substantial fine, and a permanent condition barring him from any role in real estate transactions involving elderly clients for the rest of his life. He lost his job. He lost the house Bianca's family money had furnished. He moved into a small 1-bedroom apartment off the Gulf Freeway, and for the first several months after the gala, my father would not take his calls. I should tell you about the part of this story that never made it into any news segment, because it happened in a much smaller room than a federal courtroom or a gilded ballroom, and it mattered just as much to me as any of it. About 4 months into the prosecution, District Attorney Priscilla Van called me into her office on a Friday afternoon, and I could tell from the careful way she closed the door behind me that whatever was coming wasn't good news. "I got a call this morning," she said, sitting on the edge of her desk instead of behind it, which was her way of softening whatever she was about to say. "From a county commissioner whose re-election campaign has received substantial contributions from at least 2 of Desmond Castellane's business partners over the years. He's suggesting, delicately, that maybe this case would be better handled by an attorney without, in his words, a personal conflict of interest, given that the victim happens to be your own father." I felt my stomach drop, but I kept my voice level, the same discipline I had used in that police station months earlier. "Are you removing me from the case?" "No," Priscilla said, and something in her voice hardened into the exact kind of steel that had made her the first Black woman ever elected district attorney in this county. "I am telling you that somebody with a lot of money is scared enough of you to make that phone call, which tells me you are doing exactly the right thing. I've already told the commissioner that this office doesn't reassign prosecutors based on donor discomfort, and if he wants to make that a public conversation, I would be more than happy to hold a press conference about it myself." She looked at me steadily. "But I need you to understand what you're up against here, Imani. This isn't going to end when Desmond Castelaine goes to prison. Men like him have long memories and longer reach. You need to decide right now, with clear eyes, whether you're prepared to carry that with you for the rest of your career." I thought about my father sitting in that hospital waiting room with dried blood on his collar. I thought about Miss Ruth Ann holding my hands at her front door. I thought about the 10 other families whose names I now knew by heart, whose stolen histories had been quietly folded into spreadsheets and shell companies for years before anyone with the right training and the right stubbornness happened to be sitting in a family kitchen at 3 a.m. to notice. "I'm prepared," I said, and I meant it more fully than I had meant almost anything else in my life. There was one more piece of support I hadn't expected, and I want to give it space here because it mattered. My partner, Desmond, no relation, thank God, the universe apparently has a sense of humor, a pediatric ICU nurse named Desmond Ruiz, who I had been quietly dating for 8 months before any of this started, sat with me through most of the worst nights of that investigation. The nights I came home too wired to sleep after reviewing another family's forged deed. The nights I cried in the shower so my father wouldn't hear it through the guest room wall of my apartment, where he'd been staying since the separation from my mother. He never once told me to slow down or take it easier on myself. He just kept showing up, kept making sure there was food in the refrigerator and clean clothes in the dryer during the months I genuinely forgot those things existed. And on the night the plea agreement with Desmond Castelaine was finally signed, he was the first person I called. Before Agent Cho, before Priscilla, before even my father. "You did it," he said, and I could hear him smiling through the phone. "We did it," I corrected him, thinking of every single person who had carried a piece of this case on their shoulders. Denise with her forensic patience, Agent Cho with her federal muscle, Malik with his flawed, complicated, ultimately real cooperation. Miss Ruth Ann with her trembling hands and her unbroken will, and my father, who had let himself be handcuffed and drugged and paraded through his own community's oldest wound, all so the truth would have somewhere solid to stand when it finally came out. My father finally agreed to see Malik 7 months after the gala, and he asked me to be there, not as his lawyer, just as his daughter, sitting in the same chair I'd sat in 100 times growing up, at the kitchen table where I'd first shown him the forged mineral lease. Malik arrived looking smaller than I had ever seen him. his expensive suits long since sold off to help pay restitution toward the civil settlement, wearing a plain button-down shirt that could have belonged to anybody. "I'm not going to pretend I understand why you did what you did," my father said, before Malik had even finished sitting down. "I've had months to think about it, and I still don't fully understand it. But your sister told me something once, a long time before any of this happened, back when you two were kids fighting over who got to ride in the front seat. She told me the difference between you and her was that she always wanted to win an argument, and you always just wanted to be liked. I think somewhere along the way, that turned into wanting to be somebody. And you let the wrong people convince you that being somebody meant having what they had." Malik's eyes filled, and for the first time since I'd known him as an adult, he didn't try to hide it or explain it away. "I know I don't deserve to just walk back into this family, Dad. I'm not asking for that. I just needed you to know that when it mattered, when I finally had the choice between protecting myself and protecting you, I chose you. I know it took me way too long to get there. I know a lot of damage happened before I did." My father was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table. "The land is still ours," he finally said. "Every acre of it. Clean, clear, with the mineral rights fully restored and a federal judgment on the record protecting it for good. That happened because your sister refused to stop fighting, and because you finally found the nerve to stop being a coward. I'm not going to stand here and tell you we're fine, Malik, because we're not. And I don't know how long it's going to take before we are. But I'm willing to find out." "That's more than I thought I'd be able to offer you 6 months ago, so I'd take it if I were you." It wasn't forgiveness. Not fully. Not yet. But it was a door left open instead of slammed shut, and watching my brother nod, unable to speak past the lump in his throat, I understood that some repairs happen slowly, in small kitchen conversations, long after the courtroom drama has already faded from the headlines. My mother's path back into this family has been longer, and so far, incomplete. She and my father finalized their divorce 9 months after the gala, a quiet, unremarkable legal proceeding that felt almost absurdly small compared to everything that had led to it. She kept the house in Sugarland she'd always been so proud of, the one my father had worked overtime shifts for 15 years to help pay off, and she has spent the better part of a year, according to secondhand reports from cousins and old church friends, telling anyone who will listen that she was manipulated too, that she never truly understood what Malik and Bianca were planning. A version of events that conveniently forgets the sound of her own hand connecting with my face in a hospital hallway, and the words she said to me while my father lay in a trauma bay 30 feet away. I don't know if my mother and I will ever fully repair what broke that night. I have made peace, slowly and imperfectly, with the possibility that we won't. What I have learned, watching this entire story unfold from the inside instead of from behind a prosecutor's table, is that love that comes with a price tag attached was never really love in the first place. It was just a very convincing performance of it. The same kind of performance Bianca gave in a police station at 3 a.m. The same kind of performance my mother gave in a hospital hallway an hour later. Real love doesn't need you to slap your daughter to prove your loyalty to somebody else's money. The federal sentencing hearing for Desmond Castellane took place on a gray Tuesday morning in the downtown federal courthouse, 11 months after the gala, in a courtroom packed so tightly with reporters and victims' families that the marshals had to open an overflow room down the hall with a video feed. I sat in the second row, Not at the prosecution table, since another attorney in my office had been assigned as lead once the conflict of interest concerns Priscilla had warned me about were formally resolved by keeping me on as a consulting witness rather than lead counsel. A compromise I understood, even as it frustrated me. But I was there for every single minute of it, holding my father's hand through the entire proceeding. The judge allowed victim impact statements before sentencing, and 5 of the 11 affected families chose to speak. Miss Ruth Ann Odell went first, walking slowly to the podium with the help of her granddaughter's arm, and she looked directly at Desmond Castelain the entire time she spoke, never once glancing down at notes. "I buried my husband on that land," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "I raised 4 children and 11 grandchildren on that land." "You looked at 81 years of my life and saw a line item on a spreadsheet, Mr. Castelain. I hope somewhere in that federal facility they send you to, you have a long time to sit with exactly what that says about you. Because I don't need your apology, and I wouldn't believe it anyway. I just needed you to hear, one time, out loud, that I was never confused about what happened to me. I knew exactly what your company was doing, and I am standing here today because women like me do not go quietly, no matter how many degrees and how much money you think separates you from us." My father spoke last among the victims. He walked to the podium the same way he'd walked across that ballroom stage months earlier, steady, unhurried, dignified. "I spent 31 years running into burning buildings to save people I had never met," he said. "I never once asked what a person had done to deserve rescue before I pulled them out. That was the job. You don't get to choose who's worth saving when the building's on fire." He paused, looking at Desmond, who sat perfectly still at the defense table, his expensive suit somehow already looking smaller on him than it had at the gala. "But I have thought a great deal this past year about the difference between a man who runs into fire to save strangers and a man who lit fires under his own neighbors just to watch what he could pick up out of the ashes afterward. My family survived what you tried to do to us because my daughter would not stop fighting, and because 10 other families found the courage to stand alongside us instead of staying quiet and ashamed the way you were counting on us to be. That land my grandfather bought in 1952 is still ours. It will still be ours after you are released from prison. It will still be ours after your name has been forgotten by everybody except the people whose lives you tried to steal it from. I forgive you for my own sake, Mr. Castelain, because I refuse to carry your hatred around in my chest for the rest of my life, the way you clearly carried it around in yours. But forgiveness is not the same thing as forgetting, and this whole community is going to remember exactly what you did for a very long time." The judge sentenced Desmond Castelain to 11 years in federal prison, 1 year for every family whose land his company had targeted, plus full restitution with statutory interest, and a permanent federal ban on ever holding a real estate or mineral development license again. When the marshals led him out of the courtroom in handcuffs, he did not look back at the gallery once, not at his daughter's empty seat, not at the row of families whose lives he had spent years quietly dismantling. I don't know if that was arrogance or shame. I've decided it doesn't matter which. Something else came out of this case that I did not expect when I first walked into that precinct at 3 a.m, nearly a year and a half earlier. Working with Priscilla and 2 state legislators who had followed the case closely in the press, I helped draft what eventually became known, somewhat to my embarrassment, as the Bellamy-Odell Act, a piece of Texas state legislation that closed the exact loophole Desmond Castellane's operation had exploited for years, requiring any mineral or land use lease involving a homeowner over the age of 65 to undergo mandatory independent legal review and a live video recorded notarization before it can be filed with the county, along with a public registry cross-referencing notary commission numbers against active filings in real time. So the kind of expired commission scheme that stole 11 families' land could never quietly slide past a county clerk's desk again. It passed the state legislature almost 18 months after that first phone call from my father, with bipartisan support that genuinely surprised me, and I stood behind the governor at the signing ceremony, with my father beside me, both of us wearing the same steady, exhausted pride. We held our own celebration a few weeks after that, smaller and much more meaningful to me than any signing ceremony in Austin. The whole Auburn Bend community gathered on my father's 42 acres on a warm Saturday afternoon in June, close enough to Juneteenth that it felt like it belonged to the same tradition of remembering what survival actually costs and what it's worth celebrating when you manage it anyway. Miss Ruth Ann came, walking slower than she used to, but steadier in spirit than I'd ever seen her. 6 of the other affected families came too, their land finally, formally, permanently protected under a new community land trust my father had helped establish, specifically to make sure no single generation's decisions could ever again put the whole property at risk from one bad actor inside the family. There was barbecue smoke curling up into a cloudless sky, and somebody's cousin had brought a sound system that played gospel and blues, and eventually, once the sun started going down, some old Motown that had my father dancing with a woman from 2 doors down, while I stood at the edge of the gathering, with Desmond Ruiz's arm around my shoulders, watching. Malik came too, hesitant, staying mostly near the edge of the gathering, helping carry folding tables and coolers without being asked, the way you do when you're trying to earn your way back into a room, one small, wordless gesture at a time. My father didn't pull him into the center of things, but he didn't send him away either. And at one point, I watched the 2 of them standing side by side near the smoker, not talking much, just standing there together, in the kind of silence that isn't comfortable yet, but also isn't hostile anymore. And I understood that was probably as much progress as either of them was capable of in that particular season of their relationship, and that it was enough for now. I want to tell you honestly that I have not spoken to my mother since the day the divorce was finalized. I don't know if that will change. Some family fractures heal with time, and some just become part of the landscape you learn to walk around, the way you learn to step over a root that's grown up through a sidewalk instead of trying to dig the whole thing out. I used to think forgiveness was something you owed people automatically, out of some obligation to blood. I don't believe that anymore. I believe forgiveness, like everything else that actually matters, has to be earned honestly. One true reckoning at a time. The same way my father earned his way back to standing on his own 2 feet in front of 300 strangers in a ballroom. The same way Malik is slowly, imperfectly, earning his way back to folding tables at a family barbecue. I should tell you one more thing that happened, because it's the part of this story that reminded me why the work never actually ends, just because one case closes. About 4 months after the sentencing, I got a call at my office from a woman named Odessa Franklin, 83 years old, living out past Sedagast, who had seen a local news segment about the Bellamy-Odell Act and recognized her own late husband's handwriting on a mineral lease she'd never fully understood, filed 6 years earlier by a company that had since dissolved and reformed under a different name. A name that, Once Denise and I pulled the paperwork, traced back through 2 shell layers to a limited partnership that Desmond Castellane's now imprisoned operation had quietly spun off before any of this became public. It turned out there was a 12th family after all, one that had slipped through the original pattern search because the paperwork had been filed under a subsidiary we hadn't identified yet, dormant and easy to miss unless you already knew exactly what you were looking for. I drove out to see Mrs. Franklin myself on a Sunday afternoon, and she met me on her porch with a photo album full of pictures of her husband standing on that same stretch of land 40 years earlier, a young man in his army uniform home from Vietnam, planting the first row of pecan trees that still shaded her front yard. I always wondered why those royalty checks stopped coming a few years back, she told me, turning the photo album pages slowly. I figured the well just ran dry, like everybody kept telling me it would. I didn't know to ask any more questions than that. Didn't know there was anything to ask. We filed the additional claim within the month, and because the legal groundwork from the original prosecution was already sitting in a courthouse record, it moved faster than any of the original 11 cases had. Restitution granted within 90 days instead of the better part of a year. It was a small case in the grand scheme of the sentence Desmond Castelaine was already serving. One more name added to a growing restitution ledger that had started with my father's 42 acres and had grown, almost against my will, into something much larger than any single family's grievance. But it mattered enormously to Mrs. Franklin, and it mattered to me because it confirmed something I had started to believe over the course of this entire ordeal, that this kind of exploitation rarely stops at the edges of the story anybody happens to catch on camera. It keeps going, quietly, in the margins, until somebody with the training and the stubbornness, and frankly the personal stake, decides to keep pulling every single thread all the way to the end. I get invited now, more often than I ever expected to speak to law students about elder financial exploitation, about forged notarizations, about the specific vulnerability that sits at the intersection of aging, generational land ownership, and family loyalty that gets weaponized instead of honored. I always tell them the same thing I'm telling you now. The most dangerous fraud in the world does not look like a stranger breaking into your house at night. It looks like somebody you love, sitting across the dinner table from you, telling you exactly what you want to hear, while they quietly maneuver your own signature onto a document you never fully read. I still work in the same office at the Harris County District Attorney's Building, though I've been promoted twice since that night in the precinct, and I now run the Elder Fraud Division myself, with Denise Okafor working full-time as our lead forensic investigator, a job I fought hard to create a permanent budget line for once the Bellamy-Odell Act passed and gave us the statutory teeth to justify the staffing. Malik still comes to Sunday dinner most weeks now, quietly, humbly, still folding tables when nobody asks him to. My father still walks the property line of those 42 acres every single morning at dawn, the way he has his entire life, though now he does it with a walking stick his firefighter crew gave him at retirement, engraved with a line from scripture he's never told me the meaning of, and I've never asked. Because some things belong to a man's own private conversation with his history. I think it's worth telling you the actual story of how that land came into our family, because I didn't fully understand it myself until a year I spent defending it forced me to go digging through county archives and family stories I'd only ever heard in fragments at holiday dinners. My great-grandfather, Ezekiel Bellamy, worked as a bricklayer in Houston through the 1940s, saving cash in a coffee tin buried under the floorboards of a rented house because he didn't trust the segregated banks of that era to hold on to a black man's money without finding some excuse to lose it. In 1952, A white landowner named Harlan Voss, who had inherited a stretch of undeveloped acreage out past the eastern edge of the city and had no particular use for it, agreed to sell 42 acres to Ezekiel for cash, at a price steeper than what he would have charged a white buyer, but cash all the same. No bank involved, no loan officer who could quietly deny the paperwork the way so many were denying black families across the South during those years. Ezekiel walked 3 miles into downtown Houston carrying that entire coffee tin of savings in a canvas sack, and the county clerk who processed the deed that day, according to a family story my grandmother used to tell, made him wait outside on the courthouse steps for over 2 hours before finally agreeing to file it, just to make him understand, without ever having to say it outright, exactly whose permission he was operating under. Ezekiel didn't say a word. He waited on those steps until the clerk called him back in, and he walked home that evening owning 42 acres of Texas dirt outright. No mortgage, no bank that could foreclose on a technicality, no landlord who could raise the rent out of spite. He planted his first crop of cotton the following spring, and by the time my grandfather inherited the land 20 years later, it had already fed 3 generations and buried 2. My father was the one who decided back in the 1980s not to sell when the first wave of developers came through, offering what seemed at the time like life-changing money for undeveloped land near a growing city. He told me once, when I was maybe 9 years old, sitting on the tailgate of his truck watching the sun go down over that same field, that every generation gets exactly one chance to decide whether the story ends with them or continues past them. And he had decided a long time before I was born which kind of ending he wanted to be responsible for. Sitting with him on the porch the week after the sentencing hearing, watching my niece and nephew, Malik's 2 kids from an earlier relationship before Bianca, chase each other across that same field in the fading evening light, I understood something I don't think I could have fully understood before living through everything this case put us through. Land like that isn't just property. It's a record, written in dirt instead of ink, of every ancestor who refused to disappear quietly, and every single person who tried to take it from us across 4 generations, whether it was a courthouse clerk making a man wait on the steps out of pure spite, or a billion-dollar energy company hiding behind a forged notary stamp, was ultimately trying to erase that record. They never once succeeded. And watching those 2 kids run barefoot through grass their great-great-grandfather bought with cash out of a coffee tin, I finally let myself believe, all the way down, that they never actually will. People ask me sometimes, usually the law students at those speaking engagements, whether it felt strange prosecuting a case that involved my own family, whether it compromised my objectivity, whether I was ever afraid of being too close to it to see clearly. I always give them the same honest answer. Of course it compromised something. I am not a machine, and I never pretended to be one. Not that night in the precinct, not during any of the 18 months that followed. What being close to it actually gave me, though, was something most prosecutors never get the privilege of having, which is an unshakable, bone-deep understanding of exactly what was at stake for every single family whose case crossed my desk after that. I had sat in Miss Ruth Ann's kitchen and held her trembling hands. I had watched my own father's wrists come out of handcuffs raw and bruised. I knew, in a way no textbook could have taught me, precisely what it costs a family to have their history quietly priced and sold out from under them by people who will never have to live with the consequences. Agent Cho and I still talk occasionally, mostly professional calls now, about new cases her division is tracking. But she told me something once, a few months after the sentencing, that has stayed with me ever since. We were sitting in a diner going over case files for an unrelated matter, and she set down her coffee and looked at me with the kind of tired clarity that comes from years of watching exploitation cases move through a system that too often treats them as minor property disputes instead of what they actually are, a form of violence that just happens to use paperwork instead of fists. "You know what the hardest part of this job is?" she said. "It's not catching them. Catching them is honestly the easy part, once you have the evidence lined up. The hardest part is that for every Desmond Castellan we take down, there are a dozen smaller versions of him operating in every county in this country. Men who never build an empire big enough to attract federal attention, who just quietly, patiently pick off one elderly homeowner at a time, one forged signature at a time, and never once get caught. Because nobody like you happens to be standing in the right hospital hallway at the right moment with the right professional training to notice." She shook her head. "The Bellamy-Odell Act is going to save more families than either of us will ever know about, because most of them will never even realize how close they came to losing everything." I carry that conversation with me into every new case my division opens now. A reminder that the work doesn't end just because one villain goes to prison. It just moves to the next family, the next forged deed, the next elderly homeowner sitting alone at a kitchen table, wondering why a check that used to arrive every quarter suddenly stopped coming. Bianca was released from the minimum security facility about 14 months after her sentencing, and I ran into her, of all places, at a grocery store in a part of town neither of us used to frequent, both of us reaching for the same brand of coffee on a Tuesday evening. She looked different, thinner, quieter, her hair cut shorter than she'd ever worn it during the marriage, dressed in plain jeans and a simple sweater, instead of the designer wardrobe that used to announce her presence before she even entered a room. "I'm working at a nonprofit now," she said, before I could decide whether to speak to her at all. "Legal aid intake, mostly filing paperwork, nothing glamorous. I'm not telling you that to impress you. I just wanted you to know I'm trying to actually build something that isn't built on somebody else's back for once." She hesitated, her hand still resting on the coffee shelf. "I think about your father sometimes, what he said to me that night, about not knowing what it cost me to grow up the way I did. Nobody had ever said anything like that to me before, not with kindness in it. I don't expect forgiveness from your family, and I don't think I deserve it yet, but I wanted you to know I heard him." I didn't tell her everything was fine between us, because it wasn't, and I'm not sure it ever fully will be. But I told her I hoped the nonprofit work was good for her, and I meant it, because somewhere underneath everything Desmond Castellane had spent 30 years grooming his daughter to become, there had always been a person capable of choosing something different. And watching her choose it, even years too late, even after all the damage, felt like its own small, complicated kind of justice. My father's ribs healed within the first 6 weeks. The physical wounds always heal the fastest. But I watched something quieter take much longer to mend. The particular exhaustion of a man who had spent his entire life running toward danger to save other people, only to discover that danger could walk into his own living room, wearing his daughter-in-law's face and his own wife's blessing. For the better part of a year after the gala, he had trouble sleeping through a full night, waking at odd hours to walk the property line with a flashlight, checking fence posts that hadn't moved, reassuring himself in the dark that the land was still exactly where he'd left it. I understood that ritual better than I let on. I did something similar myself, driving past his house some nights on my way home from the office, just to see the porch light on, just to confirm for my own peace of mind that nothing had changed since the last time I checked. He started sleeping through the night again around the same time the Community Land Trust filed its final paperwork, a legal structure that meant the land could never again be put at risk by a single family member's forged signature or coerced power of attorney, because now it required unanimous board approval from a group that included not just Bellamy family members, but representatives from 3 of the other affected families, people who had every reason in the world to make sure nobody, inside the family or outside it, could ever quietly maneuver that acreage away from the people it belonged to again. I think that structural safety, more than any prison sentence or restitution check, is what finally let my father exhale. He also started, somewhat to my surprise, mentoring young men through a program at his old fire station. Boys aging out of foster care who needed somebody steady to show them what a disciplined, honest life could actually look like from the inside. He never talked about the case with them directly, at least not that I know of. But he told me once that every single one of those boys reminded him a little of Malik at that age. Hungry for approval, unsure yet whether they were going to build their character around earning things honestly or around chasing whatever looked shiniest in front of them. And he said he figured if he could catch just one of them early enough, before somebody like Desmond Castellane ever got the chance to find him, that would be worth something too. The Community Land Trust expanded faster than any of us expected. Within 2 years of its formation, 5 additional families in Independence Heights and the 5th Ward, families who had heard about our case through word of mouth or the local news coverage of the sentencing, reached out, asking how to structure similar protections around their own generational land, before anybody ever got the chance to threaten it in the first place. I helped draft a template agreement, working alongside a legal aid clinic downtown, and Denise built out a simple public database anyone could search to check a notary's active commission status before signing anything, free of charge, funded initially out of my own office's community outreach budget, and eventually picked up by a statewide Bar Association grant once word of the Bellamy-Odell Act's early success started spreading to other counties. I got engaged to Desmond Ruiz on the same porch where my father had once sat with me as a child, watching the sun go down over that field, on a warm evening almost 2 years to the day after that first 3 a.m. phone call. He didn't make a big production of it. No hidden ring and dessert, no elaborate scavenger hunt. Just the 2 of us sitting on the steps after a long Sunday dinner with my father and, tentatively, Malik and his kids, watching the sky go orange and then purple over the pecan trees Mrs. Franklin's late husband would have recognized instantly. He took my hand and told me he had spent 2 years watching me carry the weight of an entire community's stolen history on my shoulders without once letting it break me. And he wanted to spend the rest of his life being the person who helped me set some of that weight down at the end of each day. I said yes before he even finished the sentence. My father cried when we told him, which I had genuinely never seen him do in my entire life, not even at the height of everything the family had gone through. He hugged Desmond so hard I heard the younger man's back crack, and he told him, with the same steady conviction he'd used to stand up out of that wheelchair in front of 300 strangers, that any man willing to stand beside his daughter through what she'd just walked through was already exactly the kind of family he'd been hoping to welcome for years. We got married on that land the following spring, under a canopy of pecan trees strung with simple white lights. No ballroom, no bronze oil derricks decorating the tables, just folding chairs borrowed from the same church my father had pastored his own father's funeral out of decades earlier, and enough barbecue smoke curling into the evening sky to make the whole property smell like every good memory I had of growing up there. Miss Ruth Ann sat in the front row in a wide-brimmed hat the color of ripe peaches, and Mrs. Franklin brought a jar of pecans from her own trees as a wedding gift, telling me with a wink that a marriage built on stolen land never lasts, but one built on land that had been fought for the right way would outlast anybody's doubts. My father walked me down a grass aisle instead of a marble one, and when the officiant asked who was giving me away, he said, in a voice that carried clear across the whole gathered crowd, "Nobody is giving her away. She was never anybody's to give. But I am honored to walk beside her while she chooses this for herself." Which was such a perfectly Reuben Bellamy thing to say that half the guests were laughing and crying at the exact same time. Malik stood up during the reception, uninvited to speak but too moved to stay quiet, and gave a short, halting toast about how he had spent most of his adult life chasing the wrong definition of what it meant to build something worth having, and how watching his sister marry a man who showed up for the hard, unglamorous parts of a relationship instead of just the parts that photographed well had taught him more about real wealth than every dollar Bianca's family had ever dangled in front of him. It wasn't a perfect speech. It wasn't fully forgiven or fully healed. Not yet. Maybe not ever completely. But it was honest. And coming from Malik, honest had become its own kind of hard-won gift. I think about that wedding a lot now, more than 2 years later. Whenever I'm sitting in my office reviewing another elder fraud case that's crossed my desk, another family whose trust got weaponized by somebody who was supposed to protect them instead, I think about how close we came, that first night in the precinct, to losing everything. The land, my father's dignity, maybe even my father himself if that lamp had connected differently, or that fraudulent competency filing had gone unchallenged long enough to actually take root. I think about how much of what saved us wasn't luck, or even skill, though both of those mattered. It was the simple, stubborn refusal of enough people, my father, Miss Ruth Ann, Mrs. Franklin, even eventually Malik, to accept the story somebody else was trying to write about who we were and what we deserved to keep. My father still walks that property line every morning at dawn. My grandmother's coffee tin, the actual physical tin Ezekiel Bellamy carried 3 miles into downtown Houston in 1952, sits on a shelf in my father's living room now, empty of cash, but full of something else entirely. A family's proof that they were here, that they built something, that nobody ever successfully erased them, no matter how many decades or lawyers or forged notary stamps they threw at trying. If you've stayed with me this far, I want to leave you with something more useful than just the ending of a story. Because I think about the people watching this who might be sitting somewhere right now, noticing small warning signs in their own family that look uncomfortably familiar. In my line of work, I've learned that elder financial exploitation almost never announces itself the way Hollywood teaches you to expect it, with a masked stranger or a threatening phone call from an unknown number. It shows up gently, wearing the face of someone who says they love you. It shows up as a relative who suddenly starts visiting more often, right around the time a spouse passes away, or a diagnosis gets mentioned at a family dinner. It shows up as paperwork introduced casually, over coffee, described as just a formality, just insurance, just something to make things easier down the road. It shows up as a family member who conveniently arrives with a notary already in tow, who discourages you from having your own attorney review something first, who gets defensive or accusatory the moment you ask a single clarifying question. If you are the adult child of aging parents, watch for sudden shifts in who has access to financial accounts. Watch for new names appearing on deeds or power of attorney documents that your parent can't clearly explain the reasoning behind. Watch for a sibling who becomes unusually secretive about visits or phone calls with a parent who lives alone. If you are the aging parent yourself, Know that it is never, ever inappropriate to ask a second, independent attorney to review any document before you sign it, no matter how much love or urgency the person asking is wrapping around the request. A document that truly protects you will still protect you after a second set of eyes has looked at it. A document that only works if you sign it quickly, quietly, and without outside review is very rarely the gift it's being presented as. And if you ever find yourself standing in a hospital hallway or a police station at 3 a.m, watching a system default to believing the person who looks the part of a victim instead of the person who's actually bleeding, I want you to remember what I learned that night. Raw anger will get you removed from the room. Documentation, patience, and knowing exactly which levers of the system you're allowed to pull will get you justice, even when justice feels impossibly far away in that first, terrifying hour. It took me 18 months from that phone call to a federal sentencing hearing. It felt, some nights, like it would never end. It ended anyway, because I refused to let it not end, and because I had a father steady enough to stand back up out of a wheelchair the moment it mattered most. I never told you what happened in the 72 hours immediately after that gala, and I think it's worth circling back to before I close this out, because it taught me something about how quickly a private family reckoning can turn into a public spectacle once someone's phone camera catches the right 30 seconds of it. By the next morning, the grainy vertical video a guest had recorded of me standing up at that microphone, of my father rising out of his wheelchair, of federal agents leading Desmond and Bianca out through the ballroom, had already been reposted across every platform, racking up millions of views under captions I never wrote and never would have chosen. Some accurate, most wildly exaggerated, a few outright inventing dialogue that never happened. Reporters camped outside my office for nearly a week. A national morning show producer called my cell phone directly, having somehow gotten the number from a source I still haven't identified, offering what she called a 6-figure exclusive interview package if my father and I would appear together on set within 72 hours, before, in her words, the story went cold. I turned her down, not because the money wasn't tempting, but because I had 11 other families whose privacy and whose ongoing legal claims mattered infinitely more to me than a rating cycle. And because my father, when I asked him what he wanted, said only that he had spent his whole life running into burning buildings without needing anybody to film it, and he didn't see why this should be any different. We did agree, eventually, to one carefully controlled statement, released jointly through my office and Agent Cho's field division, laying out the basic facts of the case without commentary, without theatrics, letting the actual court documents speak for themselves once they became part of the public record through the indictment. It was, I think, the single most powerful decision I made in the entire aftermath, resisting the pull toward turning our family's trauma into content, because it meant that when the case finally did go to trial and sentencing, the narrative belonged to the evidence and the victims, not to whichever version of events had gone viral first. Not everyone in the family agreed with that restraint. My mother, in the early days after the gala, before the divorce was even filed, gave an unauthorized interview to a local blog, portraying herself as a woman caught between a stubborn husband and a manipulative daughter-in-law, carefully omitting the slap in the hospital hallway, carefully omitting her own words about my father having served his purpose. It didn't gain much traction, mostly because the federal indictment that followed weeks later made her framing impossible to sustain. But it was a small, painful preview of how differently she and I would remember, and choose to tell, the same set of facts for years to come. What surprised me most in the months that followed wasn't the volume of media attention. It was the volume of private messages I received from strangers, hundreds of them, then thousands. People recognizing pieces of their own family stories in ours. An aunt who'd been pressured into signing something she didn't understand. A grandfather whose competency had been quietly questioned right around the time a cousin needed access to his bank account. A neighbor who suspected but never had proof. Agent Cho's division ended up opening no fewer than 19 new investigations directly traceable to tips generated by that single viral video. And 2 of those cases eventually led to a broader multi-state task force on elder land fraud that, as of the last briefing I sat in on, has recovered close to $14 million in stolen assets across 4 states. I never expected the worst night of my family's life to become the reason so many strangers finally found the courage to ask the questions they'd been too afraid to ask about their own families. But that's exactly what happened. And if nothing else good had come out of any of this, that alone would have made the entire fight worth it. There's a particular Sunday I keep returning to in my memory, almost 3 years out from that first phone call now, that I think captures everything this whole ordeal ultimately taught me better than any courtroom victory could. My father was sitting on the porch in his usual chair, a cup of coffee going lukewarm beside him, watching Malik's kids and, by then, my own daughter, Aya, barely 2 years old, chase a wobbling soccer ball across the same grass his own grandfather had planted cotton in 70 years earlier. Desmond Ruiz was flipping burgers on the grill, badly, the way he always insists on doing despite 3 years of gentle correction from my father. And Malik was setting up folding chairs without being asked, the way he always does now, quietly earning back an inch of trust at a time. My father called me over and pointed toward the far tree line, where the Community Land Trust had recently put up a small bronze plaque, modest, unassuming, easy to miss unless you knew to look for it, listing the names of every family whose land had been protected under the Trust's charter, starting with Ezekiel Bellamy, 1952, and ending, for now, with the Franklin family, 2024, though he told me he fully expected more names to be added in the years ahead. "You know what I think about most, watching all this?" he said, nodding toward the kids tumbling in the grass, toward Malik carefully arranging chairs, toward the plaque catching the late afternoon sun. "It's not the courtroom. It's not even the night you stood up in that ballroom, though God knows I'll never forget the look on Desmond Castellane's face when he realized what kind of daughter he was actually dealing with." He took a slow sip of his coffee. "It's this. Just an ordinary Sunday. Nobody handcuffed, nobody bleeding. Nobody performing for anybody else's benefit. Just family, imperfect and still healing in places, sitting on land that's finally, truly safe. That's what all of it was for, Imani. Not the headlines, not the legislation, though I'm proud of that too. Just the right to have an ordinary Sunday on our own ground, without anybody scheming to take it out from under us while we weren't looking. I think about that conversation almost every day now, especially on the mornings I walk into my office and pull another elder fraud file off the growing stack on my desk. Another family somewhere in this state whose ordinary Sundays are currently under threat from somebody they trust completely. Somebody who has learned to weaponize love the exact same way Bianca and Malik once did. The exact same way my own mother once did in a hospital hallway I still, honestly, have not fully forgiven her for. I don't do this work anymore purely out of professional obligation. I do it because I know, with absolute certainty now, forged in the worst 18 months of my life, exactly what it costs a family when nobody stands up in time. And exactly what it's worth when somebody finally does. Just last month, a woman about my own age called my office in tears, telling me her father-in-law had just been taken to a precinct after her sister-in-law accused him of assault during what the family swears was actually a break-in gone wrong. An accusation that fell apart within hours once security footage showed the older man defending himself against an intruder who had, it turned out, been let into the house earlier that evening by a family member with a financial motive to make the old man look unstable. I sat in my office listening to her describe the exact same shape of fear I had felt driving downtown at 3 a.m. years earlier, and I recognized every single beat of it. The disbelief, the fury, the terrifying realization that a system built to protect people can just as easily be weaponized against the most vulnerable person in the room if nobody with the right knowledge shows up fast enough to stop it. I told her what I wished someone had been able to tell me that first night, back before I had any of this experience to draw on. Document everything. Trust your instincts, even when powerful, polished people are working hard to convince you not to. Move fast, but move carefully, because the truth doesn't need to be loud to win. It just needs somewhere solid to stand once it finally comes out. And most importantly, don't let anyone, no matter how much you love them, no matter how long you've known them, convince you that protecting someone vulnerable is the same thing as tearing a family apart. The people who actually tear families apart are the ones exploiting them in the first place. The people who stand up and say something are the ones trying to save what's left. Her case is still working its way through my office as I'm telling you this, and I can't share the details yet, not until it's further along. But I can tell you that her father-in-law is home, safe, uncuffed, and sleeping through the night again. And that alone, more than any headline or any legislation with my name quietly attached to it, is still the entire reason I do this job. I've thought a great deal in the years since that first phone call about why this particular kind of exploitation lands so hard and so often on families like mine. It is not a coincidence that 11 of the 12 families targeted by Desmond Castellan's operation were Black landowners in historically Black neighborhoods. Families whose land, like ours, often carries a weight and a meaning that goes far beyond its market value. Land purchased in cash, specifically because the banking and legal systems of an earlier generation were never built to serve us fairly. Land that represents, in the most literal and generational sense, proof of survival against odds that were deliberately stacked against ever holding on to anything at all. Predators like Desmond Castellan understand that weight instinctively, even if they'd never phrase it that way out loud. They understand that a family holding on to land passed down through 4 generations of struggle will often go to extraordinary lengths, will endure extraordinary internal conflict before they'll ever consider involving outside authorities. Because for so long, involving outside authorities has meant inviting exactly the kind of scrutiny and disbelief my father experienced, handcuffed on that precinct bench. That's precisely the vulnerability they build their entire business model around, betting that shame, distrust of the system, and generational trauma will keep families quiet long enough for the paperwork to finalize before anyone fights back. It very nearly worked on us. It worked, fully and completely, on 11 other families before ours. The only reason it didn't finish working on my father's land is an accident of circumstance that I think about constantly. The fact that I happen to have exactly the professional training, exactly the institutional access, and exactly the stubbornness required to recognize the scheme for what it was, and to know precisely which levers of a system that has failed my community more often than it's protected it could actually be pulled in our favor for once. That accident of circumstance is not something every family gets, and it eats at me sometimes, knowing that Miss Ruth Ann's neighbors down the street, Mrs. Franklin's neighbors on the other side of Sedagast, entire blocks of families who never happen to have a daughter with a law degree and a badge, are almost certainly still out there right now, quietly losing pieces of their own history to schemes just like this one, with nobody yet in the room to notice. That's the real, unglamorous work that continues long after the ballroom drama fades from anyone's memory. Building databases, training legal aid clinics, teaching county clerks what an expired notary commission actually looks like on paper. Making sure the next family who calls my office doesn't have to depend on an accident of circumstance to get the help they deserve. Agent Cho and I eventually formalized a standing partnership between her federal division and my county office, specifically to lower that barrier. A direct hotline any family in the greater Houston area can call if they suspect a relative is being pressured into signing something they don't fully understand. Staffed around the clock by attorneys and investigators trained specifically in the patterns Denise first identified, sitting up all night with a stack of forged filings on my kitchen table. We've fielded over 600 calls since it launched. Not every one of them turns into a case. Most of them, thankfully, turn out to be families catching a problem early enough to correct it themselves once someone explains what to look for. But some of them, more than I'd like, turn out to be exactly what we feared. Another Desmond Castellane. Smaller in scale, but no less devastating to the family living through it. Another forged signature quietly waiting to be discovered by whoever happens to notice first. I want to be honest with you about something else, because I think these stories too often skip past the cost of winning and go straight to the triumph. And I don't think that's fair to anybody watching who might be in the middle of their own fight right now, wondering if the exhaustion they're feeling means they're doing something wrong. There were nights during that 18-month prosecution when I genuinely did not know if I could keep going. I lost 15 pounds I didn't have to lose in the first 3 months alone. I stopped sleeping through the night the same way my father did, waking at 2 and 3 in the morning, convinced I'd missed some crucial detail in a filing, some loophole Desmond's attorneys would find before I did. I saw a therapist for the first time in my life that year, a woman named Dr. Patrice Kilgore, who specialized in vicarious trauma among prosecutors and advocates, and she was the one who finally helped me understand that the anger I was carrying toward my mother wasn't going to resolve itself just because the case eventually closed. That some grief simply has to be carried rather than cured. And that carrying it well, without letting it poison everything else in my life, was its own kind of victory, separate from anything a courtroom could hand down. I remember one session in particular, maybe 8 months into the investigation, when I broke down completely. The first time I had cried in front of another adult since the night of the slap in that hospital hallway, and told Dr. Kilgore that I felt like I was failing everyone, failing my father by not moving fast enough, failing the other 11 families by prioritizing my own father's case first, failing my relationship with Desmond Ruiz by disappearing into case files every single night instead of being present with him. She let me finish, and then she said something I've repeated to myself more times than I can count since. She said that the work of protecting people you love from exploitation is never going to feel like enough while you're in the middle of it, because the scale of the harm being done is always going to outpace the speed of any single person's ability to fix it. But that doesn't mean the work isn't working. It just means healing and justice move slower than the damage that caused them. And expecting yourself to close that gap overnight is its own kind of cruelty. One you don't have to inflict on yourself, on top of everything Desmond Castellane already inflicted on your family. I think about that session almost as often as I think about the plaque under the tree line at my father's property, because it reminds me that the version of this story that fits neatly into a video, hook, confrontation, twist, arrest, resolution is real. Every bit of it happened exactly the way I've told you. But it happened slower and messier, and with far more quiet exhaustion than any highlight reel could ever capture. If you are in the middle of your own fight right now, against a system, against a family member, against a lie that's been allowed to calcify into something that looks like truth simply because nobody challenged it soon enough, I want you to know that the exhaustion you're feeling is not a sign you're losing. It is simply the actual weight of doing something that matters. And it does get lighter, eventually, once the truth finally has somewhere solid to stand. I should tell you a little more about Denise Okafor, too, because without her, none of this ever gets past a single forged signature sitting quietly in a county recorder's office, unnoticed, unchallenged, exactly the way Desmond Castellane's operation was counting on it staying. Denise left the Harris County Crime Lab 6 years before I ever called her, after watching a supervisor quietly shelve a forensic document analysis that would have overturned a wrongful conviction. Because reopening the case would have embarrassed a sitting judge up for re-election that year. She told me once, over coffee during the darkest stretch of our investigation, that she didn't leave the lab because she stopped believing in forensic science. She left because she stopped believing the institutions around that science could be trusted to actually act on what it revealed. Going independent meant she could choose her own cases, work directly for attorneys and families instead of for a bureaucracy with its own competing interests. And it meant that when I called her at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night with a single forged notary stamp and a gut feeling that it wasn't an isolated incident, she had the freedom to spend the next 3 days doing exactly the kind of exhaustive, unglamorous cross-referencing that eventually uncovered 11 other victims nobody else had connected yet. She still works with my office regularly now, officially on staff, as I mentioned, though she jokes that she negotiated her contract specifically to preserve the right to walk away from any case where she smells the same kind of institutional foot-dragging that pushed her out of the crime lab in the first place. I've never once had to test that clause. Denise has become, over these past 3 years, less a colleague and more something closer to family. The kind of family you choose rather than the kind you're born into, which I've come to understand matters just as much, sometimes more. The land itself has changed in small, meaningful ways, too. My father, with the land trust's blessing, set aside 4 of the 42 acres for a small community garden and a modest gathering pavilion, open to any family in the neighborhood who wants to plant something or hold a celebration there, free of charge. Funded by a portion of the restitution settlement he insisted on directing back into the community rather than keeping for himself. Miss Ruth Ann has a raised bed there where she grows collard greens every fall. Slower now, with her granddaughter's help, but still out there most Saturday mornings with dirt under her fingernails, telling anyone who'll listen exactly how this whole fight got started, embellishing certain details a little more each time she tells it, which I've decided is exactly the kind of privilege a woman who survived what she survived has fully earned. We named the pavilion after Ezekiel, a simple wooden sign my father carved himself, Ezekiel's Rest, and underneath it, in smaller letters, a line my father insisted on adding once the whole ordeal was finally behind us. It reads simply, "Bought with cash, kept with courage." And every single time I drive past it, whether I'm coming for a Sunday dinner or just passing on my way to somewhere else entirely, I feel something settle in my chest that no courtroom victory, no legislation with my name attached to it, no viral video has ever quite managed to replicate on its own. There's a question I get asked more than almost any other. At the speaking engagements, in the comments under news segments about the case, in messages from strangers who found their way to my office phone number after recognizing pieces of their own family and ours. People want to know if I've forgiven Malik completely, if I've forgiven my mother, if there's a version of this story that ends with everybody reconciled around one table, the way these things sometimes get wrapped up in movies. I understand why people want that ending. I wanted it myself for a long time. But I've come to believe that forcing a tidy reconciliation onto a wound this deep would actually be its own kind of dishonesty. The same kind of performance Bianca gave in a police station at 3 a.m, just aimed in a gentler direction. What I have instead is something messier and, I think, more honest. I have a brother who shows up now, consistently, humbly, doing the unglamorous work of earning trust back one folding chair at a time. And I have chosen to let that ongoing effort mean something, even though the wound underneath it hasn't fully closed and might never fully close. I have a relationship with my mother that exists mostly in silence, punctuated by the occasional stiff, formal exchange at a family funeral or a milestone neither of us can avoid attending. And I have made peace, as much peace as I think is honestly available, with the possibility that this is simply what our relationship is now. Not broken, exactly, just permanently changed shape, the way a bone sets crooked if nobody resets it in time. And I have a father who stood back up out of a wheelchair in front of 300 strangers, who forgave a man who tried to destroy him because he refused to carry that man's hatred around in his own chest for the rest of his life, who taught me, without ever sitting me down to say it directly, that forgiveness and accountability are not opposites, that you can hold both at once, that you can want good things for someone while still insisting they answer fully and completely for what they did. That, more than any single arrest or any piece of legislation, is the inheritance I actually walked away from this entire ordeal carrying. Not the 42 acres, though I am endlessly grateful those are still ours, still protected, still growing collard greens and pecan trees and a 2-year-old's wobbling first steps across the grass. The real inheritance was watching my father choose, over and over again, across the worst 18 months either of us had ever lived through, to fight for what was his, without ever once becoming the kind of person who takes what isn't. I think, too, about the version of myself who used to sit through family dinners as a teenager, quietly furious at how differently my mother treated Malik, how easily his ambitions were praised while mine were dismissed as impractical, how thoroughly the whole family seemed to agree, without ever saying it outright, that his path toward money and status was the one worth protecting, while my path toward justice was something to be tolerated at best. I spent years internalizing that hierarchy, wondering privately if maybe they were right, if maybe fighting for people who couldn't pay top dollar for representation really was, as my mother once put it, a little office fighting battles I couldn't win. Standing in that ballroom, watching federal agents lead away the very embodiment of everything my mother had spent decades teaching us to admire, I finally understood, all the way down in my bones, that she had the entire hierarchy backward from the very beginning. The battles I'd spent my career fighting, the ones that never came with a corner office or a country club membership attached, turned out to be exactly the training I needed the one night it mattered more than any single case ever had before. Every hour I'd spent learning to spot a forged signature, every late night reviewing elder exploitation statutes that most of my law school classmates considered a career dead end, Every unglamorous, underpaid year building a reputation as somebody who actually cared about the people on the losing end of a rigged system. All of it converged in a single ballroom on a single night. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the exact thing that saved my father's life and, eventually, 12 families' worth of stolen history. I don't say that to be dramatic. I say it because I think there's somebody watching this right now who has been told, the way I was told for years, that the thing they care about most, the unglamorous, underpaid, unrecognized work of protecting people who can't always protect themselves, doesn't matter as much as the paths everyone around them seems to be chasing instead. I want you to hear this clearly, from somebody who lived the alternative version of that story. It matters. It is going to matter in ways you cannot yet predict, on a night you cannot yet see coming, and when that night finally arrives, you are going to be exceedingly grateful you spent all those quiet, unrecognized years building exactly the skills it turns out you needed all along. One last thing before I close this out. A few weeks ago, Aya, my daughter, now 3 and stubborn in exactly the way I apparently was at that age, according to every relative who still speaks to me, asked my father why there was a plaque under the trees with a bunch of names on it. He sat her down on his knee right there in the grass and told her, in the plain, patient way he's always explained hard things to children, that a very long time ago, a man named Ezekiel walked 3 miles carrying all the money he had in the world in a coffee tin because he wanted his family to always have somewhere that belonged to them and nobody else. He told her that a while back, some people tried very hard to take that somewhere away, and that her Aunt Imani, that's me, wouldn't let them. Aya thought about that for a long moment, the way toddlers do when they're turning something over that's slightly too big for them yet. And then she asked if the bad people were in jail forever. My father laughed and told her not forever, but long enough, and that the land itself, unlike people, actually can last forever if enough of us keep choosing to protect it. I was standing on the porch, listening to the whole exchange, and I understood. Watching my daughter run back off toward the pecan trees afterward, that the story doesn't actually end with a sentencing hearing, or a wedding, or even this video. It just keeps handing itself down, the same way that coffee tin got handed down. One generation deciding, over and over again, to be the reason it keeps going, instead of the reason it stops. Before I let you go tonight, let me tell you where things stand right now. My father still walks that property line every single morning at dawn. Ezekiel's coffee tin still sits on his living room shelf, empty and full at the same time. The Bellamy-Odell Act has now been cited as a model in 2 other states drafting similar legislation. And somewhere, in a federal facility, Desmond Castelain is spending year 4 of an 11-year sentence, no longer able to look at a struggling family's land and see nothing but a line item on a spreadsheet. They used to call me the difficult daughter, the one who chose a career nobody in my family understood, the one who was never going to be somebody the way my brother was supposedly going to be somebody. But on the night it actually mattered, I was the only person in that ballroom who understood exactly what kind of storm was coming. And I was the one still standing at the end of it, holding my father's hand while the truth finally had somewhere solid to stand. My name is Imani Bellamy. I still practice law in Houston, and I promise you, if anybody ever tries to steal your family's history out from under you, the way they tried to steal ours, I hope somebody exactly like the woman I've become is standing close enough to notice.